So today's story is one of the four accounts of the resurrection. And you'll notice that it's actually two stories. There's two stories of the resurrection in this reading. There's the one that we expect to hear about two of the Marys come, they see the rock move back, and then they eventually meet Jesus. We know that story, and we expect that one. But Matthew also insists on putting in this story about the guards. Why is that? Well, the guards had been told earlier on, just one paragraph before the reading that we heard today, that the temple officials had heard Jesus talking about how I'm going to come back after 3 days. The Messiah is going to be killed, and then the Messiah will be resurrected. And the temple officials don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's why they had him arrested in the first place, insisted on him being crucified. So they're afraid that his followers are going to perpetrate a deception and that they are going to steal his dead body out of the tomb and then claim that he was resurrected. So to prevent that from happening, they say, let's post some guards in front of the tomb where the rock is, and that way no one can steal the body. But of course, that's not the way the story turns out, because when the two Marys walk up, wondering, how are we going to move the rock? It's huge and it's heavy. They watch as an angel moves the rock by having an earthquake occur. The earthquake moves the rock aside, and then the angel talks to the guards and the Marys, but there's no body in the tomb. The guards have been guarding an empty tomb, even though the rock was there. It's very odd. And then the angel says to the two Marys, don't be afraid. He is fine. He is risen. The guards are petrified by this. They find this absolutely terrifying. We're told that the angel looks like lightning and with clothes as bright as snow. So he's a blinding presence, whoever this angel is. He or she, we don't know. And the guards are just terrified. They can't move. They're scared to death. The Marys, however, keep their wits about them. They've been following Jesus this far. They know that strange things happen. And so they hear what the angel has to say, and they start heading back to Jerusalem. And along the way, they meet Jesus. The story, however, continues in Matthew's account. He doesn't just tell the Mary side of the version. He wants you to know the tail end of the guards' story. The guards, having seen all of this, go back to the temple officials and tell them. And they say, you won't believe it. This extraordinary thing has happened. And the temple officials, this is terrible news. This is the last thing they want to hear, that Jesus might actually be on the loose and that the body wasn't in the tomb. So they say, here's some money. Tell the lie that the disciples stole the body. And that story must have been pretty convincing, because Matthew is still is saying that it's still kicking around 50 years later when he writes the gospel. And the fact of the matter is, all things considered, if you had to compare these two stories, the guard story does sound more convincing. It's pretty straightforward. A man died, he was put into a tomb, some of his buddies moved the rock back, they stole his body. That's really easy to believe. There's no supernatural stuff in it, you don't have to believe in the Messiah, nothing special happens, it's just life is business and life as usual. But there's a subtext to this story, right? The guard's version contains all the events which happened before, too. There was this man who claimed he was the king of the Jews, who claimed he was the Messiah. He was going to make life uncomfortable for us here during this Roman occupation. He was a danger to this peace. He was going to make our lives miserable by bringing down Roman rage on us. So we better get him arrested for blasphemy and endangering the peace. And that's what they did, right? It was the guards who went to the garden who arrested him. The guards who escorted him to the trial that found him guilty and handed him over to Pilate. So the guards, for this story to make sense, is a guilty man was arrested. A guilty man was killed as he should have been, and a guilty man was in that tomb when his equally guilty and untrustworthy followers stole his body. That's the guard story. The world is dangerous, and you need guards. That's the guard story. The guard story is still with us. We have a modern version of the guard story. If you watch television at all, you know that there's a lot of crime shows on television. I went through the broadcast schedule for this week, and in the United States, on the 3 big networks, there's always a crime show on television. Every single night, there's a crime show. Some nights, there's 5 and 6 crime shows on television at the same time. You know them: Law and Order this, Law and Order that, CSI this, CSI that, SWAT, Magnum PI, there's FBI, and then FBI International. There's all these crime shows. And all these shows give a general impression that most of us, whoever we are at risk of crime, and usually most of these shows focus on homicide. Right? Most of them are about people who get killed. People who are like us. Right? People who are middle class, upper middle class, usually white. It's usually white people who get killed on these shows. And they're often killed by people they don't know, strangers. Life is dangerous, and you're always at risk of getting killed. That's what these shows say. And most of the shows are set in big cities, right? That's why there was CSI Miami and CSI Vegas, right? They're always in cities. They're in big cities. And these shows are popular. When we watch them, they get ratings. That's why they're still on television. I mean, what is it? Season 26 of Law and Order? These shows have been around for a really long time because we like to watch them. They're successful. They are the modern version of the guard story. The world is dangerous, and you need conscientious guards to protect you from the dangers which are really out there. And it's not just on television and these fictional representations that we hear the guard story. It's also in real life. In New York City, right now, like us, they've had a spike in violence on their subway system. There's also a lot of homeless people who are on the subway system in New York City. The mayor, Mayor Adams, is a former transit policeman, a guard. And his answer to this crisis has been to flood the New York subway system with police officers. They've done it on a scale that we have not. They've just been flooding the subway with police officers, and those police officers have an order that if they see any homeless people there who are, say, sleeping on the benches or just loitering, they are to escort them off and take them off out of the subway system into the streets. That's what they're there for, to just clear the homeless out of the subway system. And if any of those people are exhibiting any signs of mental health distress that suggest that they might be a danger to themselves or anybody else, the police have been given the power as of December to forcibly take them off the subway and take them to hospitals, mental hospitals and regular hospitals. So they're just trying to clear out all the people they perceive as troublemakers. It's a guard's answer to a social problem. More police, and just keep them moving, get them out of there. In Toronto, of course, we've also seen similar sorts of problems. We've had violence on our subways, and we have voted a number of times. City Council has approved extra funding for putting more police as well as more subway transit security officers onto the subway. Another $15 million was approved by City Council just last week or the week before. And the last act of our outgoing mayor was to approve a budget that had an extra $48 million for the police. Over loud objections from community groups all over the city, the police got a raise. So the guard story is not just something that we watch on fictional TV, on Law and Order and so forth. It's also something which happens in real life. But there's a problem with the guard story, and here's what it is. It's not accurate. Every year, for the past few years, Statistics Canada has released a report on what homicide is like in Canada. And it doesn't match at all what we see on television. It's completely different. The television shows tell us that if you are at risk of homicide, chances are you're living in a city. Not true. The per capita murder rate is much higher in rural areas than it is in cities. It's 1.7 times higher in rural areas. So if you're afraid of getting shot, don't move to the rural areas. Don't retire to the country. So cities are pretty safe, but if you did have to live in a city and you wanted to say, let's say we wanted to have a CSI Canada in one of our Canadian cities, which one should it be? Well, you might think Toronto. We're the biggest city in Canada, lots of murders happen here. But actually, Toronto, and the list of cities that are affected by homicide, is number 17. We're not even in the top 10, much less the top 5. We're down around number 17 in terms of per capita homicide risk. If you wanted to have a CSI show in Canada, you would have to put it in Regina. CSI Regina would be a good place because they have the highest murder rate in the country. And then if you wanted to have a Law and Order in Canada, you'd probably put it in Winnipeg because they're always in the top 5. And then if you wanted to have one of those, there's that series Chicago PD, well, in our case, it would need to be Thunder Bay PD because they've had the highest murder rate for like 4 or 5 years running. They're always in the top 5. The shows on television suggest that anybody can be killed. Everybody's at risk. It's not that simple at all. In Canada, some 28% of all homicide victims are racialized, and they're usually Indigenous. So if we were to have these crime shows, 1/3 of the time, the victim would be an Indigenous person, pretty close. Indigenous or Black, those are the high-ranking racialized people. In addition, if the victim is a woman, the case is solved almost as soon as it begins. Because tragically, 70% of all women are killed by a lover, current, or former. It's a cinch to figure out who kills a woman, because it's almost always your husband, your boyfriend, or your ex-boyfriend. That's just the way it is. And with men, it's much the same. You're rarely killed by a stranger if you're a man. In real life, what happens is if you're killed, chances are 25% of male deaths are caused by gang-related violence. And then the balance, are usually caused by either you're in debt to somebody or it's a revenge killing. You've angered someone and they've decided to kill you back for it. Okay, so what about, could it happen to us? I mean, we get into debt, sure. We run afoul of people sometimes. Well, the other factor is over half of all people who are killed in Canada have a criminal record. And over half of all the people who do the killing have criminal records as well. So if you have a criminal record, you might be a little nervous if you were living in the country, particularly if you're Indigenous and so forth. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that have to go wrong for you to be a victim of violence. And when it comes right down to it, 80% of everyone who is killed in this country knows their killer. So this whole idea that we're walking around in cities in danger all the time because a stranger might kill us is a fiction. It happens, but it's not very often. Now you might say, well, hang on a second. 2 weeks ago, there was a poor 16-year-old boy who was killed sitting on a bench in the Kiel subway station by a man he didn't know. That's true. And that case and others like it have been used to increase the presence of the guards on the TTC and to justify increases in the police budget. However, that particular man who did that homicide has been in and out of jail for years, suffered from childhood abuse, and has known mental health problems. He's not afraid of the police. He's not afraid of going to jail. He's just doing what makes sense to him, which is tragic and horrible. But putting more guards on the subway wouldn't have slowed him down one moment, because he doesn't care if he gets caught, because he gets caught regularly. The guard story is everywhere in our society. That doesn't mean that it's true. So here's something else that they leave out of the story. This graph shows the homicide rate in the United States from 1990 to 2020. It's down. There's a little bit of a spike during 2020 because COVID was hard on everybody. But the overall graph is down. And in Canada, it looks almost exactly the same. Yep, and it goes down as well. That's homicides and attempted homicides. And you can see it just sort of goes down. And that's from 1971. The guard story tells us that we're always in danger. There's always a stranger who can kill us. We shouldn't feel safe, but what we should do is hire more guards. It's an old story. It's a familiar story. It's easy to remember, but it doesn't mean that it's accurate. But it's very good for keeping us in fear, keeping money out of social services and back into the police budget, and it's not really solving the problems. Matthew is well aware of the problems with the guard story, and that's why he includes it in his resurrection account. But it's only one of two stories about the resurrection. The other one, of course, is the Mary story. And it's the one that we're familiar with, but we don't really look at it too carefully, so I want to look at it carefully right now. The Marys come up, and they see the stone get rolled away by the angel. There's no body in the cave. Whenever Jesus left, he left before that stone got rolled back. So this whole let's put guards in front of the tomb is a red herring. Jesus got out of that tomb, however, without moving the rock. If he'd moved the rock himself, the rock would be out of the way when the Marys arrived. That's not what happened. And Matthew doesn't explain how Jesus got out of the tomb. He just goes, hey, look, he's not in the tomb. No explanation. Weirdness number one. Weirdness number two, the angel sits on the rock, bright as lightning, speaks to the two Marys. The guards are scared to death on the floor. And he says, hey, don't be afraid. It'll be fine. Jesus is doing exactly what he told you he was going to do, and he'll meet you and the disciples in Galilee. So go back to Galilee, or rather, go back to the disciples and tell them to make their way to Galilee. That's where you're going to meet Jesus. Okay. That sounds sensible. I get that plan. Except that they start walking away. They're down the road a little bit, and who shows up but Jesus? Hey, greetings! And, you can imagine how the women felt, right? The last time they saw Jesus alive, he was on a cross. He was being tortured. They'd sliced into his side. He'd been bleeding. Awful. And yet here he is, looking hale and healthy. Of course, it's no surprise. Their hearts must have been bursting with joy. They fall down on their knees, and they put their heads on his feet. Just like, I can't believe you're here. What a wonderful moment. But why is it happening? The angel just said he'll meet you in Galilee. And not like 2 sentences later, Jesus contradicts the angel. That's weird. Why does that happen? Matthew's no dummy. He wrote this. He can see that he's lining up a bunch of contradictions. The only story that makes any smooth, common sense in this is the guard story. The guard story, you can get your head around. It's simple to understand, straightforward, easy to remember, more convincing. But the guard story is inaccurate. What Matthew is saying is, the guard story isn't going to save us. The guards just want more guards. They want more power. They want to be able to take advantage of people. The way out of that is to cultivate a form of consciousness which is more open and more imaginative, one that can actually deal with a few contradictions. So Matthew presents us with this kind of salad of contradictions about the most important story in the faith. And he's saying, I want you to break open a bit. In Zen Buddhism, people meditate for years, and then they go to their master, and the master says, okay, I think you're ready, and the master provides a koan, right? A koan is one of those riddles which is supposed to allow you, as you think about it, to lift yourself out of normal logic and reach the next spiritual level. So what is the sound of one hand clapping is a koan. It doesn't make any rational sense, but that's the point. By thinking about this, you actually lift yourself out of the common sense level, and you can reach a higher level where you can start to believe and see things which are different from that you could see when you're just in the common sense level. Matthew is saying, listen, Jesus asked you to believe in impossible things for 3 years. He asked you to love your enemies. He asked you to believe that people who are dyed-in-the-wool sinners can change. He asked you to believe that when you have messed up over and over again, you can change, and God will still love you even though you did that thing. All of these things that the world says, no, that's impossible. Bad people are bad. They should be locked up. We need more guards. There's bad people everywhere. Jesus is saying there's no such thing as a bad person. There's people who just need help. People who can be saved through love and compassion. And not just from God, but from us. But for us to do that work, we need to start believing in impossible things. We need to be able to hold 2 or 3 mutually contradictory ideas in our heads at the same time. Jesus wasn't in the tomb and there were guards in front. The angel said, I'll see you in Galilee, but Jesus showed up right afterwards. This story doesn't make sense, and it's not supposed to. It's an invitation to get beyond common sense. An invitation to go to the next level spiritually and go, maybe things aren't as predictable and boring as I thought. Maybe the guards with their story, which makes perfect sense, but keeps us under the thumb and nothing ever changes, maybe there's something better than that. So that's what Matthew offers us when he tells the story of the resurrection. We can be lifted out of the grim predictability of common sense that the world can never change and we just need more guards. And we can be lifted into becoming those people who are loving and going, you know what? I think the world can change. I think that even though we've been incredibly racist and homophobic and sexist, we can still change. Society actually has some hope in it. We can do that. And it may not make any sense to the guards. It'll be hard to convince the guards, and we'll probably convince them last. But that's okay. Give them time. Let them watch our example. Let them watch how life can come out of death. Amen.